member and one of the first members of the Washington, D.C. chapter. So I'm really happy to see the progress that it has made in the last 5 or 6 years. I'm also co-director at the Center for Emerging Market Policies, and it is my pleasure to have an exceptional group here with me, and I'm going to introduce them really quickly, and then I'll pass it on to them. So in alphabetical order, from that side, just to emphasize that, we have William Beach, who's the director from the Center for Data Analysis of the Heritage Foundation. As director of the center, William Beach is the think tank's chief number cruncher. He oversees Heritage's original statistical research on taxes, social security, energy, crime, and a host of other issues. Under his leadership, Heritage has acquired one of the largest collections of privately held public policy databases in the US, as well as a variety of peer-reviewed analytical models. He's also on the economics advisory panel for ABC News. Our next panelist is Nikunj Jinsey, who is head and chief investment officer of the Climate Business Group, Clean Technology Investments at the IFC and National Finance Corporation. He combines over 20 years of experience in various industry sectors and blends operational, entrepreneurial, investment banking, and over 15 years of emerging market private equity experiences as well. Prior to joining the IFC in Washington, he spent almost 9 years living and working in Asia, and where he was managing director and head of the Singapore office for one of Asia's leading venture funds. And in addition, he was also the co-owner of Southeast Asia's largest independent marketing communications agency, which was successfully sold to Omnicom, the largest media marketing group in the world, in 2002. Thank you for being here. We also have Guy Pfefferman, who is founder and CEO of the Global Business School Network. He joined the World Bank's Young Professionals Program, in December 1966, and he served as chief economist for the Latin America and Caribbean region from 79 to 87, and chief of debt and macroeconomic adjustment division from 87 to 88. He was also director of the economics department and chief economist for the IFC from 1988 to 2003. In 2003, he founded the Global Business School Network at the IFC and continued to serve as CEO after his retirement from the World Bank in 2006. He has taught at Johns Hopkins University, SAIS, and from 2003 to 2007, he was a member of the board of directors of the Global Giving Foundation. He's currently on the advisory board of the Association of African Business Schools, and his most recent publication with Nora Brown, Empowering Tomorrow's African Entrepreneurs and Managers of the Global Business School Network. It's his latest work. And we also have Sebastian Staros from the World Bank, who represents Polish authorities at the executive board of the World Bank Group, leading the European representation during the Polish presidency of the EU. Prior to joining the bank, Sebastian was working at the forefront of the monetary policy in Poland as chief economic advisor to the governor of Polish Central Bank. In 2006-2007, he worked as chief economist at one of the leading Polish commercial banks, and prior to his career in the financial sector, Sebastian was consulting major global companies and was affiliated with the University of Oregon, Warsaw School of Economics, and the Conference Board in New York, doing research on business cycles, monetary policy, financial sector, and the legal market. So, as you know, we're here today to discuss some of the global issues of business policy and emerging markets. And as you're aware, recently the world has witnessed economic and political shifts with the rise of emerging and transitional countries and their forms as well. And these changes are being reflected in the conversations and the negotiations that are being held at the multilateral organizations, some of which are represented here on the panel. So today, we also see an increased focus on entrepreneurship here in the United States as well as in developing countries. So given this context, what are the implications of these changes in the global competitive landscape for international business, for policymakers, and the future of emerging economies as well? And as these economies undergo institutional transitions, what are the challenges facing these nations as well as their firms? And as you know, we live in a very exciting, interesting, and constantly changing, sometimes on a daily basis, world economy right now, and how do we as individuals get impacted by some of these events or developments, and what should we do to prepare ourselves for the future? So without much further ado, I'm going to pass it on to our speakers. So we'll start with the beach, and we'll move in this order. If you could just share some of your thoughts with us, and yeah, so we'll take it.
Well, thank you very much, Sonia, and I'm very pleased to be here at this meeting of Beta Gamma Sigma. I'm not a member, and if I do a good job, maybe you'll give me an honorary membership. Many analysts have spoken about the future in terms of the impact of technology. I won't be speaking about that, but I wanted to assure you that I believe that that's very real. At one point in my career, I decided I would make millions of dollars working for a telephone company, and worked for a small company in the Midwest called Sprint. We had just started business, and we were doing well, you know, laying fiber optical cable all around the world, all around the country, and hooking people up right and left, and seeing marvelous things happen to telecommunications. What really enforced, in my mind, the veracity of a tremendous force in technology in the future was our experiences in Hungary. The wall had just fallen, and one Eastern European country after another was taking a look at their telephone systems and noticing that most of them were laying in the ditch. Lead cable, full of water, unable to conduct electricity. And they asked Sprint to come over and build the entire telephone system for Hungary. So we did. And what we did is we put in place micro towers all over the country, macro towers and micro towers. And in one summer, didn't quite do it in the summer, it took more like 8 months, but most of the work was done in the summer. We took that country from a telephone system that dated from the 1920s to a telephone system that dated in their future because it was constantly deploying new oil. And no doubt that will be producing enormous benefits for the Hungarians, and then we also did some work for what is now the Czech Republic and so forth and so on. And AT&T was over in Poland. I mean, it was a wonderful time. At that time, some futurists looked at the world and they said, remember, this is 1989 to 1993. We will have such wealth in the future. There will be so many enormously wonderful things happen that those people who argue that the future is a dim place are simply off base. The year 2000 ran around and you saw books come out one after another arguing that across the 21st century there would be unprecedented per capita abundance. There would be no poverty by 2050. There would be no even small poverty cells, right? Except for older people like me who decided to drop out and do drugs or whatever, I don't know. And I think that's right if you take one set of assumptions and put them in place. After all, I'm a member of the largest U.S. population ever to enter retirement, the boomer generation, but I'm sure you all know, boomers are all over the world. After World War II, every big country and small country had a sudden jump in their population growth rates. In the developing world, this was due largely to the implementation of public hygiene, of good nutrition, and of penicillin. But every country has this bubble. And in the West, in the what I would call the West, excuse me for the term, but it's like Europe and the United States and Canada, there was enormous growth. If you looked at the assets that this generation got and was scheduled to get from their parents, the World War II generation, you would say, well, $18 trillion worth of transfers to the boomers from the Great Depression generation, plus the promise of technology, there surely cannot be a problem in the 21st century that is a dollar sign problem. We can fix Social Security and Medicare if we can get the Democrats and Republicans to kiss each other on Capitol Hill. And you know, if they won't, we'll put guns at their back and say it's a forced marriage. We will get this done. And the estimates in 2001, and I had a hand in these, of the assets that the boomer generation would give their children were enormous. We were looking at ranges between 36 trillion and 41 trillion in $2,000. That's an intergenerational transfer. That's what's left over after Grandpa's given up the ghost. So if you were sitting in 2001, 2002, arguing that we ought to reform Social Security and Medicare because after all it would be a financial disaster if we didn't, at the back of your mind you're saying, yeah, that's not really true. Because technology will lead us to a bright future, that intergenerational transfers in the West will be so enormous, especially in Europe, that there's no real problem. The subject of my talk is the interplay between two things, demography and debt. Because in 2000, 2001, 2002, we knew about a trend. You know, demography is all about drift, right? I mean, it's no surprise. Well, Newt Gingrich discovered the fact just a few weeks ago that we're going to have a huge population of people retiring. But for most people, we kind of knew that starting in 1947. So demography is drift, but debt was not seen. And I think that those two combinations have changed the game. And I think they've changed the game, and I'll make this my argument. They've changed the game fundamentally for the 21st century, unless we go down another road on debt. So you have this enormous generation moving like crazy towards retirement. I'm kind of on the edge of that. I was born in 1949, which makes me 35. And so what's different about me, or my generation? We're very healthy relative to the preceding generation. Even though some of us, you know, haven't really done what we ought to do, nevertheless, on average, our life expectancy is high because we're healthy going into retirement. Some of us are even running at age 60, 61, 62. We shouldn't be. It's stupid. And we don't wear reflective clothing, but, you know, what the heck? Get us and the grandkids get all this money. That means that we'll be a long-lived generation, longer than expected, actually. We thought it was fine because we'd saved up, you know, $41 trillion. And then, in December of 2007, our investment portfolios began to disappear. They disappeared steadily, by the way. I can personally report this, from January, February, March, on into 2008, on into 2009. And about 35% of the net worth of the boomer generation in the United States was wiped out. That continues in some cases today, net worth losses. But what's remarkable is this is a worldwide loss of net worth. Not just in the West, but in the East, it was everywhere. Second point. Governments in the same countries where the net worth is disappearing and people are rapidly moving towards retirement, where they were going to live now for 30 years in retirement, on the government's money, and their own, decided that the way to get rid of the recession was to go into debt. Probably okay, a little bit of it, you know, stimulate the economy, keep things moving along. But because we have all this taxable wealth out there, and all these talented people, they really went into debt. And this happens in all the countries, pretty much, that also have this aging population. So now we have a very different look at things. Technology is still there, but technology is capital dependent. It's not labor dependent, is it? You need capital to fuel the innovators, the entrepreneurs, the deployers. capital is tied up in debt. And the boomer generation is moving into retirement with less money than what they thought they were going to have. How many in this room are under the age of 35? Just see the close show things. I always raise my hand on this question. All right, you are what I call the debt-paying generation. Unlike any other generation in U.S. history, that, you know, war-fighting generation, disease in generation, whatever, your mission is to repay debt. And the reason it is because we can't roll it over to your children. It's so large that public sector debt must be, in a sense, mostly paid down. Get down from what is expected to be 181% of GDP by 2020, down to something like 60 or 50% of GDP. And to pay back the basically $22 or $3 trillion that has to be paid back in today's dollars, your taxes will rise and your government spending per capita will fall. And so what happens here, to get down to the implications for the 21st century, take US case, generalize it in most of the West, and then think about its implications for capital and economic activity. Because we have a generation, not mine, but yours, and the Xers, and the Y generation. Because that generation must be devoted both to their own well-being and to paying back debt, public sector debt, it's very likely that the increase in the real tax rate, that's calculated as an increase in the actual tax rate plus a decrease in governmental transfers, you have to add those two together, so it's called that the tax rate, will be so high as to slow the economy below its potential, significantly below its potential, and the trend in wage growth, and thus in wealth formation, savings, will be low for your generation, well below your potential. Sociologists tell us when that happens, marriage rates fall. Young people look out on the future and they say, maybe it's not a good time to start a family. Marriage rates fall, or the age of marriage increases, and the population growth rate falls as a consequence of that, due to the fact that there's there's a limitation on the childbearing ages. If that's the case, we are not renewing our labor capital. And if we don't renew our labor capital, then a lot of things don't happen. Mortgages are taken on later in life. There's less capital flowing into the most productive form of per person lending, and that is to build a family and to capitalize children. That's in the common speak. Educate kids, okay? That's really good debt. That's really good debt. 30% of the intergenerational differences in mobility are due to education, the single largest factor. We'll do less of that. And because there'll be less savings, there'll be less money for your retirement, and so forth and so on. You see how it changed. So to sum up, to finish, the trend, the demographic drift continues. But the thing which came in, which we didn't think was going to be there, was this tremendous, enormous, inescapable, worldwide Western threat. So to get out from underneath this future and make the 21st century the century we thought it was going to be, when we were just looking at telephone service and thinking how cool it's going to be if we have like things we can carry around that will talk to us and keep our schedules and send little messages to each other, we have to solve that. Thank you.
Are we going gloom and doom? Welcome everybody. Sake of reintroducing myself, my name is Nikunj Jinsi. I'm with the International Finance Corporation, which I presume many of you know is the private sector investment arm of the World Bank Group, where we focus on making investments in emerging markets. The next speaker probably has more years of experience at the IFC than I have, but so the risk of taking away out there, let me explain that we're probably one of the largest investors in emerging markets. By a bank standard size, we are not big. We have a $35 billion balance sheet, a AAA rated institution, but we pretend, or we believe we can make a difference by catalyzing the private sector coming in with us in emerging markets. You would have seen my background. I operate in the finance field. I am an investor. In fact, right now I run a innovation-driven investment group within IFC, and I'll get to that a little later. I too started my career in the telecom industry, working for a telecom player in Europe. And at that point in time, when I started, the cellular phone was considered to be a luxury item. We did not have GSM phones. We had what you called Scandinavian invented phones on a standard called NMT. And only then we were in the early stages of developing what you call now a 2G or GSM phone. It was considered to be a luxury item, but even then, people at IFC, long before I joined, thought that there is an opportunity for innovation on a cellular phone that is worthwhile funding. And as anything else, innovation, an unusual business model, receives a lot of resistance. And there was a lot of resistance to fund telecom operators considered to be a toy for the rich in emerging markets. There was a lot of resistance to fund that, because what IFC does and what the World Bank Group does is to cater to the poor, and the bottom line for us is to eliminate poverty in emerging markets. Turns out that there was this little innovation, there was a lot of innovation on the technology side, but there was a little concept that got introduced in the telecom space known as a prepaid card that changed the business virtually overnight. Prepaid card gave telephone access to people in emerging markets that elsewise couldn't afford a phone, couldn't afford to buy a phone, and got access to telephony. And the rest is history, I would almost say. We were actually one of the founders of Westel in Hungary, and we subsequently went on to fund, not by ourselves, but help to catalyze funding into many of the operators in Southeast Asia, South Asia, and Africa. And now we have over 3 billion people getting access to telephony, and there's a clear correlation between that level of innovation and GDP growth. There's a clear metric between that. So in line with the previous speaker, and in line with my career really, my focus has been continuously for the last 20 years on innovation, either working in the innovation industry or funding innovative projects. And I couldn't agree more that innovation is going to be key to bring down the cost of goods and services. But yes, it requires a lot of capital. Now, innovation could be hyped up, as we saw in the late 90s, early 2000s with the internet, where media did a great job hyping up success stories, and then subsequently with the burst did a great job digging a hole in the ground and burying it. The truth of the matter is that even after internet supposedly was dead, there were a lot of people who ended up making lots of money out of Web 2.0, Web 3.0 kind of opportunities. So if you don't want to go with the media hype and rather go with mega trends and macroeconomic thoughts, there's always an opportunity, and innovation will never stop. I read an article in last week's Wired magazine that essentially declared clean technology dead, which is the business I operate in now, so basically I'm out of a job. That was mostly predicated on the rise and fall and demise of Solyndra, which many of you would have heard of, is a large solar company. A lot of it's got a political angle in it, given that the Obama administration put a fair amount of subsidy in it, but I continue to invest in the solar industry, so I'm still fairly bullish as a long-term investor on just the renewable space. The point I'm making here is that you can go by the ups and downs of what's happening in Silicon Valley or other pockets of innovation. It would be silly to ignore what's going on in the world macroeconomically. For one, in the current wave of innovation, if you look at it historically, you initially had the Industrial Revolution that largely started out of England and Western Europe. That was in the early 1900s. Subsequently, you had the Technology Revolution, which was at the end of the 1900s. That you had the center of it mostly in the U.S. Silicon Valley, Route 28, Boston, and pockets in Europe. And now we're looking at the green tech innovation, and there you literally find the innovation centers all over the world, and that's keeping in mind with the topic of our discussion. I spend a lot of time traveling outside of the US, much of it in Asia, some of it in China, and the amount of innovation going on there now, not necessarily high-tech innovation, but applied technology, applied towards real business models, is nothing less and nothing less impactful than what you see happening in this part of the world. Again, keeping in line with a previous speaker, you know, the US and Europe have macro problems now, much of it driven by the debt burden. The US has a $15 trillion GDP and a $60 trillion debt load, if I'm not mistaken. Europe is not in much better shape, as you would have read in the newspapers in the last couple of months, whereas China has a $6 trillion GDP, limited debt, and a $3 trillion surplus. And so the mentality and the mindset of people who are growing up there now, and other parts of the world, Brazil has it's not the same story, but it's a comparable story. India has a story as well. The mentality of young people growing up there now is quite different from what you'd find amongst entrepreneurship here. There is a difference though in approach. There's no one bucket for emerging markets. Each market is different. China in itself is a different world. Obviously 1.3 billion people, which is centrally governed, where the government is key and critical towards stimulating and regulating specific subsectors, which they have done quite successfully, although they're going to be facing challenges as well going forward. Whereas in India you have a democratically elected government, which has also a very young population. Speaking about demographics, China's likely to run into the demographics problem after 2020, which is not all that unlike what's happened in Japan, where you're having, you know, with a one-child policy, you have an aging population, people having higher life expectancies, yet with the one-child policy and a bit of a imbalance in the gender ratio, there's likely to be less productive labor, as William mentioned, in Chinese markets starting 2030 and beyond, and you'll find less labor having to support an increasing grain part of the population. A place like India has less of that effect. I believe the statistics are that over 45% of the population is below 30 there, and so it has less of that issue. It has a lot more other issues, but you know, from a long-term perspective, the productivity in a market like that has a different characteristic than it has in China. So why are we getting into that? I think it's you know, getting into the topic of entrepreneurship. And as mentioned in China, the government is very active in stimulating specific subsectors and is very active in creating effectively what I believe is one of the most capitalist nations in the world. Even though the political system hasn't really embraced that yet. And there's lots of foreign capital going in there, there's lots of technology being deployed out there, there's a lot of stimulation to develop local systems and protocols in specific subsectors. And in India, I think the IT story is well known. It's done a great job around Y2K in building out IT services firms. And now it's going through the challenge of what next, how to go build up through the value chain going forward, not just being dependent on labor and cheap labor, because the inflation has also kicked into India, but more about how do we develop the next product company that is world-renowned and world-famous. How do we get into the next green technology business that has effective impact? Now, innovation remains important. If you look at clean tech and you read the media here, you'll think that again it's something that is critical and important for the wealthy, and it's kind of a luxury thing to have solar panels, you know, on top of your roof. The reality is we are funding solar businesses to help bring down the price of what you call a watt per kilowatt per hour, or you know, cost per watt. Effectively to bring it down below what you call grid parity, and grid parity is an important concept in this part of the world, where you want to make sure that developing solar energy is cheaper than developing regular energy, whether it's through a coal-fired plant or a gas-driven plant. In emerging markets, the equation is slightly different because you do not have a grid in many cases, and a solar solution For example, we're looking at solar-powered lanterns being distributed in parts of sub-Saharan Africa. And so a solar solution there is pretty much one of the few solutions that are available to provide electricity in a concept called rural electrification. It's an area we're quite focused on. And I could actually go on for some time. I would take away time from several of my panelists, but again, taking a macro approach towards the issues we're faced with. Today we have a population of 7 billion people. World Bank estimates by 2050 it's going to be 9.5 billion people. Most of the growth is happening in emerging markets. It is known that there is not enough land, there's not enough agricultural produce, there's not enough water to take care of such population growth. So it's absolutely critical to focus on providing not just innovative solutions, but also cost-effective solutions towards such populations to avoid many of the social economic problems that elsewhere would occur. I'd say the final comment there is that in doing so, as a previous speaker mentioned, it's not about funding luxury items, it's about funding sort of solutions that could allow emerging market populations to leapfrog as an adapter, to leapfrog technologies, whereas we in this part of the world are used to specific technologies. I refer again to the mobile telephony solutions, which here are way behind on what you find in some of the international markets. And so to fund such kind of solutions to allow us to leapfrog to technologies, but also to allow us to accelerate, to come down the cost curve for products and services, such that the people who stand to gain most from innovation funding and innovative projects would be effectively, I wouldn't call it the bottom of the pyramid, but the poor people and middle class people in emerging markets.
Well, good evening. I'm a development economist as well, and I can't resist. I got so depressed by doing and he was telling us the good news. That I think the two things that the kind of silver lining is what's happening in emerging markets and developing countries. We just heard about this, but. I cheered you up. Yes, you cheered me up. But I also think that what happens in the rich countries, particularly US, Europe, and Japan, is by no means without influence on what's going to happen to the emerging markets. I mean, even when these emerging markets were much smaller, like 10 years ago, people would say, well, they're the tail and we're the dog, and the dog wags the tail, not the other way around. But in some respects, this is still very true. I think a lot of what has happened in the last 10, 15 years can be explained by criminally low interest rates in the rich countries. And what that does is nobody wants to save, and that is catastrophic when a society stops having an incentive to save if you don't get a return on your savings. It made the rest of the world relatively more attractive, whether the investments were sound or were not sound. So you had a huge flow of capital into these countries, and that was a pretty strong determinant still. But I agree generally with the diagnosis here. One other silver lining, and I'll stop there, is that prices have come down a lot, and you mentioned phones and so on and so forth. To the extent that you can, if innovation were leading to continuing lowering prices of various things, which has happened to various extents, then the standard of living need not fall as much as it appears. I mean, incomes can be stagnant, but you can still have your flat screen, and you can phone Vladivostok for 3 cents and so on. All right, okay, I'll stop there. Why am I here? I'm not sure. I think what I'm going to talk to you about is why, as a development economist, I turned into what you might call a social entrepreneur and started the Global Business School Network. And I'll tell you a little bit about that if you're interested. And I think that it brings in a lot of the things that we've been talking about. The problem with economics and with development economics is that people are extremely good at necessary conditions in order to achieve good things. I mean, you can say that, you know, if you have high inflation, you're never going to have sustained growth in Brazil, etc. This is true. So lowering inflation is fine. But then you'll have another person who says, well, that's fine, but also corruption is a terrible thing, and you have to reduce corruption. And somebody would say, well, you need the rule of law, and you need good fiscal policy, you need this, that. This is all true. All these things are true. But I defy you to find any economist in the world, unless he's particularly presumptuous and arrogant, who will talk about sufficient conditions. No one can tell you, okay, you take country X, and here is a list of 27 things that you have to do. And if you do all these things, kind of like a doctor giving medication, you will be wonderful. You will grow, you will prosper, you've solved it. But it doesn't work that way. So, in effect, we can kind of, as a profession, quite apart from the fact that there are lots of disagreements between economists that have never been settled, and you can see it between Democrats and Republicans right now, and one could argue that if you're getting paid pretty well as an economist, it's because you're supposed to say things which are real and make sense. Well, how can two people have totally different views on the point and both be right? They can't. So, I decided in the end that this was kind of intellectually very interesting. I love the World Bank. I spent 40 years there. You travel a lot, you learn a lot. The colleagues are unbelievable. I mean, it's all fantastic. I encourage you to go and work for the bank or the IFC. But in the end, when I look at, if I think to myself, what have we really achieved, I can list a number of things, both in the World Bank and in the IFC. But it isn't what I had hoped when I was 20 or 22, and I said, well, here are all these developing countries, and I really want to devote my life to trying to be helpful. But then we discovered, a few colleagues and I, that there was a gap in the development literature. And this is very interesting. You can look, well, intuitively, we all know when there's bad management and when there's good management. You go to a restaurant, if you're not served after 20 minutes and they bring you the wrong dish, presumably you call that bad management. If you wait for the metro for 25 minutes and then nothing comes, and then the train that comes, you can't get in, that's bad management. You can compare it to Singapore, you can compare it to Shanghai, you can compare it where things work. Now, you would imagine, and anybody who's been in a developing country, how many of you have traveled in Latin America, or Africa, or Asia? Almost everybody. Well,
Who has not?
yes, exactly. Who has, all right, I don't want to embarrass you. So, you know that good management is the exception rather than the rule when you look at how things are functioning. A very simple example, when I talk to students, I show them a slide of a hospital in Africa, which is a pretty modern hospital. It's a nice building. It was funded by 8 funds. It looks really nice. And then in front of it is a huge pile of trash. Dogs, rats, etc. It's not a good thing, right? So I ask the students, well, why is this pile of trash there? And they start thinking, and they say, well, maybe municipal sanitary services don't work. I said, there aren't any. What else can you think of? Well, basically, it's that hospitals are run by doctors by and large. Doctors have been trained to look after people. They have no idea of HR, of budget, of all these things which you call management. And all it takes is somebody who says, Abdul, you are responsible for getting rid of this pile of trash, and I don't want to see it again. And if you get rid of it, good things will happen to you, and if it's still there tomorrow, not so good things will happen. That is basic management. So now you extrapolate this to a whole economy or a whole society, and you discover, when you talk to leaders of NGOs, business people, government people, and you ask them, list your 3 main headaches, and I guarantee that one of the 3 main headaches is going to be, you know, I cannot find any really good local managers. And when I find one, she gets poached within 3 weeks by another company. Is that true?
Yes, sir.
In most places. In most places. It's very true in Africa. So you have a lot of very well-meant programs, like the Gates programs, for example. But you still need somebody in the trenches who knows how to manage a team, who knows how to get things done, and how to organize. So we thought to ourselves, now, I go back to the so-called science of development economics. You can look at the whole library of all the books that have been written about development. You will not find very much, if anything at all, about the quality of management. And this we found shocking. Now, I was at Stanford the other day and I talked to John Roberts, who's one of the senior professors. And he is one of the few with a team that have been looking at the difference that good or bad management can make. This is a study of Indian textile and garment firms. And it's very interesting. They looked at what Accenture would recommend a firm to do, like 30 standard recommendations, and then they kind of looked month after month the degree to which each of these recommendations is being applied in each of the firms. And then after a year or two, you see if there's a difference between those that do and those that don't. And they found up to now the difference is about 20%, which isn't huge. So I told him, I'm surprised it's so small. So he laughed and he said he had presented his results to a mixed group of business school professors and economists. And their reactions, both of them, were, why study this? It is uninteresting. The economists were convinced, because they believe in theory, that if you have a bad manager, the market is going to do its thing, and that manager is going to be replaced pretty soon by a good manager. Managers grow on trees, right? The business professors yawned and said, well, we all know that, it's perfectly obvious. So there's hardly any empirical research about the impact of good versus bad management. And what there is very convincing. It matters. It matters a lot. So we thought, how can 2 or 3 or 4 individuals change the world and then do something about this? Now, we were very lucky to be at the IFC, so we had a calling card. People would, you could meet a lot of people. And we thought, okay, let's see if top business schools in the US and in Europe might be interested, or some people within these schools, in helping to strengthen business schools in developing countries. Because there are some, there are many in India, there are many in China, but it's a recent phenomenon. In Africa, there are few. There are only about 20 or 30 that are any good, and they're all young, except in South Africa. They're mostly like 10 years young, old. They're very embryonic. And we found a very positive response. Not because Harvard and Stanford and Kellogg and so on do a lot in developing countries, but because each of them has a small group of professors who have been working in these countries all their lives, because that's what they're interested in. So essentially what we provided, we created this network. It became a home or a tent for this subculture of professors who do development. Then something interesting happened. The students. The brightest students these days will pick a business school that they want to go to, partly and sometimes largely, depending on whether the school affords them opportunities to do some kind of Peace Corps-like work or not. This is what they want to do. They want to do good. They don't want to go to Wall Street from day one and be trapped in front of a screen. They want to do something interesting. And parenthesis, we just ran last year, and we're running again, a video competition for student teams that have done something interesting in a developing country, MBA students, and kind of 5-minute YouTube things. It's on our website. They are absolutely jaw-dropping. I mean, it is the energy, the enthusiasm, and the results are absolutely fantastic. I recommend. I'll write the email address. I mean, the website on the whiteboard later on. So, to cut a long story short, today we've spun off out of the World Bank. We're an independent non-profit organization. We're based here in DC. We have 50 business schools around the world that are fee-paying business schools that pay the Global Business School Network in order to belong to the network. And in exchange, what do we provide? One, networking opportunities. And we have an annual conference which is going to be in Delhi in June. And we get together about 150 participants, about 40 or 50 business schools. And they all want to know, they're curious about developing countries, they all want to know how do the other guys, for instance, do organize student teams that go to India? How do the other ones look at microfinance or at Islamic banking or whatever it is? So it is very interesting. And the schools, that's mainly the schools in the rich countries, the schools in the poor countries, what they want is connections which will develop their faculty. That's their main concern. And it's working extremely well, and we've done projects with the Gates Foundation. I don't know if any of you have heard of Goldman Sachs' 10,000 Women initiative. You have. Well, it's the biggest, it was at the time, 3 or 4 years ago, the biggest philanthropic initiative that Goldman Sachs had ever done. This was before the crash. And they put $100 million into, over 5 years, into. Initially, they just wanted to give scholarships to underserved women who were running tiny businesses in developing countries so that they could improve their business skills. We convinced them that in order to do that locally and do a good job, they really needed to do some capacity building locally, so they kind of rented our network, so to speak, because we had the connections between, say, Columbia University and Dar es Salaam and so on and so forth. And the result is that around the developing world, there are now some really good entrepreneurship training centers which were created under this program, which serve not just women, but they can serve anybody who wants to be trained. So we've done these projects. We are just launching into something called the Africa Management Initiative. This is the very modest title of it was 1 Million Managers for Africa, but we've changed the name. And basically it consists of 2 foundations that have funded research which will lead to a menu of options. If you want to be the Cindy Gold founder of the business school in Ouagadougou, we can tell you this is what it's going to cost you, this is the impact you can expect, etc. So we're trying to mobilize funding for this. I'll wait for questions and answers, but this is basically, I thought that this idea of quality of management, and of course it affects multinationals. I mean, everybody's now working in these markets, but the talent pool is still here, not there. So there's a huge managerial talent deficit in these countries which are growing so fast that they're outstripping the supply of global managers. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Manoj. Thank you, Sonia and Beta Gamma Sigma for having me here. It's absolutely a rewarding experience, at least for 3 reasons. The first is to speak among such distinguished and experienced panelists. And second, this is the first time I have the opportunity to speak at the George Mason University. And this is a university that I personally, I learned about in mid-90s when I was a very young professor of economics at that, without PhD, though we're working with young students in economics at the Warsaw School of Economics. And we also had the problem with capacity. Actually, older professors, which learned and were teaching economics, they mostly taught Marx. They didn't know basics and fundamentals about the market economics. So people that were, I actually started teaching economics when I was on 3rd grade. And I was working with students that were just 2 years younger. And that was the time when I started to raise my bird. So I looked much more serious, and actually neither of my students, they actually knew that I'm that young. And we hated Marx. I'm sorry, I know it's very politically incorrect to speak that kind of thing at academic institution. And it's still very painful for me to read the research made by Marx over 100 years ago. But we were at the same time very excited about Schumpeter, about Austrian economics, about Hayek. And George Mason University was one of those places that was one of not many anchors in the US academia where you actually could read about the Austrian economics, about the institutional economics, and now I believe we have much more of the institutional factors in the mainstream economics. But back in the 90s, I don't think it was there yet. Then the Nobel Prize for institutional economics just were granted, so it helped a little bit to mainstream. And actually, a couple of my students were sent by me to seminars organized by Institute for Human Studies, based at the George Mason University, which I believe is quite well known to some of the panelists. And it was an opportunity for them not only to go to the United States for the first time, but also to learn about institutional economics and better understand the different angle of economic science. So it's the second reason. The third one, why this is rewarding, is because as we speak today, we have World Economic Forum in Davos, and those of you who follow that closely know that the main topic of this year event is the Great Transformation. And this great transformation is all about the role of emerging markets in the global economy and the declining role of the developed economies. So what we are seeing, what we are experiencing now is a very strange precedence where actually we see a reversal of trends in terms of potential output, potential GDP trajectories, flow of capitals. Now we see that emerging that old debtors now becoming creditors, right? That we see accumulation of the debt that was issued by developed economies now is being held by emerging economies. But at the same time, the debt of emerging economies are not kept by developed. It's actually kept locally, which poses completely different structure for the capital flows and the entire global capital market. And coming from the board of the Bretton Woods institution, we are facing the problem with defining individual countries and defining the business model for the World Bank, for the IFC, and also for the activity of the IMF. As you know, now there are completely different clients coming to the IMF to get their money. There is discussion how much World Bank should get engaged in Europe. Of course, it's not easy to borrow money to France, and we are not there yet. That World Bank should help France, but we are looking very seriously at countries just next to the border of the Eurozone to try to mitigate potential risks that might be there. And what happened in the course of the last 10, 15 years in the global economy has amplified, and especially the recent crisis has very much accelerated this amazing convergence between the developed and the emerging economies, making this existing dichotomy of what we used to call part one, part two countries is no longer valid. Now we have what we used to call it, we call every day middle income countries, but it doesn't really help to define how the old model of the global economy and institutions like Bretton Woods should respond, and how we should position ourselves towards those countries. And I think there is no better illustration of the influence of both economical and political power than the G20 process. And G20 process was invented in late 90s, but we were not ready yet at that moment to really start it up. it was the crisis, the recent crisis, when the G20 group was actually formed and it started to work hand by hand, developed countries with the major emerging markets, trying to define the agenda for global institutions, defining agenda for regional institutions, and also for some individual governments. And if now G20, at least that's my perspective, it plays a role of a kind of steering committee for the global politics and global economy. Not to use the notion of global government, which I hate, but there is a sense that more and more depends on the G20 actions, where emerging economy have a place which they didn't have at the time when G7 was at the forefront of the global debate. And second, the emerging economies are increasing their role for two reasons. The first is what Bill described in details, the growth in population. And second is the economic growth, driven mostly by the convergence mechanism. Since I have 3 kids already, I will skip the population part. I will focus on the economic convergence. But before we get there, let me make the point, the bottom line, because I'm very bad at making the bottom line. I think there is a big challenge for the policymakers, both on the global level as well as for individual countries, to define how we should govern the countries, both emerging and developed, in the new order, in the global economies, the global politics that is emerging in the current circumstances. On the convergence, the convergence mechanisms, from my perspective, being raised in Poland, I think there are a couple issues that we have to remember. First, the convergence mechanism is somehow conditional upon factors like existing institutions. And it's not only legal framework, but there are also some intrinsic values in the society that make one country to succeed and others to fail, even though they are in a very similar geographical or position, or they have very similar natural endowment or similar population. If you look on success of some countries in the Central Europe, those who failed, those who succeeded, you can tell very different stories. And the question first on this part, and I think this poses extremely difficult challenge for policymakers, but also for business people, is whether we can replicate of the model of transition and the model of growth for emerging economy that worked well in some of the countries, for example, in Central Europe, or in China, or in India, or in Brazil, or in Mexico, and replicate that in different regions, for example, in MENA, in the Middle East, North Africa, which I think now poses the most difficult problem in terms of reshuffling the economic and political power. If you look on the young generation in those countries, including the North Africa, we should expect a big generation of young people will enter the job market. And the question is how the existing economy, especially now in a very difficult political situation, will absorb those capacities. And I think this is an incredible challenge for the innovation to try to redefine the economic model for this region in particular, but it is also a case for other regions. And I'm very glad that World Bank actually took that very seriously. And the next World Development Report, flagship report of the World Bank, will be on the job creation. And we're very proud that IFC is doing a lot of work in this context, also in the MENA region. But challenges are extreme there. And what I personally found fascinating is how to connect the spillover effects from countries like Israel, who have very successful stories of innovation, with Arab diaspora living in the US, living in the Silicon Valley, having both experience, knowledge, and money to invest in the region, and how they can try to build incubators of innovation, how they can spread first access to the markets, developed markets, but also the knowledge how to do it, how they can help to develop the capacity. And I think the point that you made about the low limited capacity in emerging markets in terms of number of managers is absolutely valid. I remember when in mid-90s I was consulting, doing some outsourcing consulting for McKinsey. And the biggest problem for McKinsey in Poland at that time was to fill job positions. They were able only to attract 10% of their capacity, which is, I think, amazing. There were just not enough young, smart people without the habits of the old communist era. The second issue about the convergence mechanism is what is the cost and what are the trade-offs? And this will be a little bit reflection on the situation in the Eurozone. And I was stimulated in that context by the report prepared by Dominique at the World Bank. If you look on the productivity in the 90s, in 2000s, in Southern Europe, in Greece, in Spain, in Poland, what I found just shocking was that, in a sense, the Central Europe has stolen a mojo from the Southern Europe. That actually you see that Northern European or Western European companies start withdrawing investments from the southern part and putting that money, that investment in the Central Europe. And to some extent, probably someone will do research on it. Maybe there is research already, that in some sense, Southern Europe now is paying the price for this incredible growth that we are observing and this convergence we are observing in Central Europe. And finally, I think one of the biggest questions for emerging markets, when we are very excited about the growth, even though the very latest numbers are not so much optimistic, and many people are speaking about recoupling of the economic growth between developed and emerging markets, is what is a term that I believe was also coined by Dominique Strauss-Kahn, one of regional chief economists at the World Bank, is the middle income trap. Generally, the more you invest and the more you adopt technology, at some point, sooner or later, you are getting to a point where the returns start to diminish. And this was the case for many countries. This might be a case for China. I do not want to speculate whether China will become the largest economy in the world in 5 years, as some claim, or in 15 years, in terms of PPP. But I would be a little bit cautious about this, because the level of investments they are putting in, and I believe this is also a case for some other municipalities across other emerging economies. They are invested based on current assessment of the land value of already made investments, and this is something that sooner or later they might find themselves in a gap, in the financing gap that they will not be able to fill. But the major problem here is how you can build a system of innovating innovation. Is there a barrier to generating innovation by those countries? And if you look on different economies, different emerging markets, at least I have the sense that some of them are culturally more probable to reignite innovation, while others are not so much. They are more in the adoption mode, trying to replicate existing models, but not so much innovating new solutions, new markets, new products. And this is something that I believe gives a big challenge for institutions like IFC, for World Bank, for activities like you do, with trying to foster development by improving managerial skills, managerial capacity, but also for the governments, how to build a policy that would promote innovation, that would foster productivity and creativity of young forces, that people will look for new products, new markets, new opportunities. One of the problems here I also see, and this will be the last comment, is that it's not always easy to replicate existing models from developed countries into emerging markets. And I remember that from my experience, that some of the technologies that were introduced in the 90s in Central Europe were brand new technologies in developed countries as well. We just skipped some parts of technological progress. You will never see in Polish offices some of the office machines, some computers, other computers, fax machines, right? That you see here in the US. And in the same context, sometimes you will never see some financial services, like checks, for example. You know, who uses checks in Central Europe? Nobody. It took me years to really develop the skills, and probably it's are underutilized by me, how to write a check. You just don't do it. There are different, better, more modern ways to do it. And in the same context, some financial services are just done, and they will be done only through the cell phones in sub-Saharan Africa. And there might be places that they will never build a road through the jungle, because it will be actually much cheaper and much more efficient to just build two airstrips and have a Cessna Caravan flying from one strip to another and bring people. And this is the very different mindset. And this elasticity, this flexibility to adjust to those very, very different needs is something that is at the very core of doing business and also doing policy in the developing and emerging economies. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was very insightful, and I wanted to, I would like to open it up to the audience for questions and answers. But just before that, I just had a couple of, a few thoughts that I wanted to see if you could share some more information with me on that. So Geek Pfefferman talked about the influence of the East on the West and the West on the East and so on. And Sebastian, you talked about how there's higher output or has been in the recent past from emerging countries as opposed to developed countries. So there's been a reversal of roles there. If roles is a good word. And we also looked at, Bill Beach talked about demography and some of the debt problems and population and so on. And I started thinking about, so where are we going to look at, where does the sort of ray of hope come from? Where does the silver lining come from? Because, Nikun Jinsey talked about the green tech innovation and so on, but obviously the emerging countries are still, if you talk to people in those countries, governments and so on, about clean technology and so on, they're a little more, they're a little reluctant to sort of, take up some of the policy initiatives that the developed governments are recommending for them to sort of start adopting. And there are a lot of stories that you hear about that being a bone of contention. So, to tell you a really short story about, we had an economist from the Asian Development Bank visit us this past Monday, and he was talking about how, some of the Asian countries are those where an aging population is not as significant of a problem right now, although it is definitely going to become one by 2050. And one young lady in the audience who was from Thailand, she got up and she said, she said that, well, you know, while that might be true, that we're going to be more productive and so on, having a younger population, etc., there is a huge gap or a disparity between the people in, people in, say, Thailand or even in a country like India, where the sort of, according to her, the wealthier population are more likely to sort of, they're producing, they have smaller families, they get married later, and they're the ones who are probably more likely to contribute productively to the labor force. And it's the lower income groups that who don't have as much access to education, which was a point that you brought up, who are sort of, they're in fact going to, in her view, be a burden on productivity and sort of suppress productivity because they don't get access to education, so you don't have a skilled sort of labor pool there. So if you think about all of that, you wonder, okay, so where do we look for solutions? Because at the time of the crisis, there were people who, such as Raghuram Rajan, who was the chief economist of the International Monetary Fund a few years ago, said, well, we could look to the East and think about how demand is rising in the East, and they don't necessarily have the ability to satisfy all those needs as far as, so where would that come from? Then that would come from the West, so trade flows will sort of pick up again, and foreign direct investment and so on. But if you put all of this together, that doesn't seem to be the picture emerging, given all these issues that we just talked about. So where do you, in your opinion, where do you think should we hope that the resources come from, or what should we hope? Because obviously we don't know for sure, but we can hope that governments channel their resources and their attention towards certain causes and needs.
I didn't want to leave the impression that there's no hope.
Of course, no.
Economists have been accused since the time of Bernard Vanderbilt of being people who like to tell other people bad news. But the truth is, it's the bad news which is the hope. Now let me just put that out. I think you'll understand, or at least if I correct you. So what is the silver lining in any social problem? It is when everyone understands that there is a problem that has to be solved. Unless we have an understanding that we are facing a dreadful problem, the dreadful problem becomes our destiny. But the moment we understand there's a dreadful problem, we've always solved the dreadful problem. After all, if you look at the size of the population of the world today, 7 billion people, in this lovely new building, we're a very successful species. We survived much more difficult problems than a bunch of debt and a bunch of boomers. I mean, it's there in the awareness of the problem that the silver lining actually exists. And here's what I think gives me great hope, and that is the problem is very trackable. It's solvable. You can't do anything about population. And we don't want to. We want to enhance population. We want to enhance life. We want to make everything happy for people. That's the goal. No one should suffer, okay? The problem, if it's debt, or if it's something like that, then there are choices we can make. We can solve the debt problem. We can let Italy and Greece go native. We can find ways of funding the transition. We can reduce spending, increase taxes, whatever. There are ways to solve those problems. My fear, my great fear, is that we're going to be locked into an inaction. And the inaction will last for a few more years, after which point the cost, the expense of solving this otherwise solvable problem is simply huge, and we'll lose a generation. That's my real fear. Not that we won't solve the problem, because I think if we just keep talking about it everywhere we can, we keep saying it's the same problem, same problem, same problem, we will find that everyone will eventually stand up to the problem, and we'll get mass solutions. We carry in our craniums computers which are just extraordinary compared to those little things that we carry around in our pockets. we can really solve these problems. Emerging markets, that's a huge area of new vitality and energy. It's a huge area of new solutions. Skipping technology paths to just completely go somewhere else. That shows you how we innovate and we get around problems by erasing the problem and jumping to the conclusion. We're capable of doing all of that, and if we do, where I started was, the 21st century could be this enormous period of unbelievable, unprecedented, worldwide wealth creation, and such that no problem is, no economic problem is really as we have defined it. And if we move to clean energy and we move to sustainable economic growth at a high level of growth, by the way, that's where I'm assisting, then the century can be good. But we are really at a turning point. If we waste our time on this problem, it's going to be so expensive, we'll lose a generation. If we lose a generation, we never get it back. And we will be that much worse off for 2 generations that follow because of the lack of intergenerational transfers. And there is no hope.
There will hope. I think what you're seeing also, if you look at some of the experiences, let's say Japan, which has had 20 years of no growth or limited growth, yet it's also had like close to zero inflation, which means that in most cases people's lifestyles haven't been impaired. What you see also at the same time is the problem hasn't been solved, and the political class isn't solving the problem, and that's evidence of the fact that you've seen 5 new prime ministers, I believe, 5 new governments in the last 3 years. And so if you take what Bill mentioned about the gridlock, effectively, it's a solvable problem, but there's huge political gridlock that's avoiding it from being solved. You see effectively a diminishment of the political class, is the way I would see it. And I would fully agree that eventually the problem will be solved because human minds are powerful, and if we all recognize how grotesque the problems are, and we are all able to recognize the granularity of the underlying issues of each problem, then we'll get there. But I think you're going to see a new world order and a new dynamics in the business world as well as the political world in the next 10, 20 years.
Well, what am I going to say? I'm not very, I share Bill's pessimism about the rich countries getting their act together. I mean, most of them. I think, unfortunately, the chip lying on its side in Italy is, to me, it's become the metaphor of what's happened to the southern part of the Eurozone. I hope not, but I fear. Poland has managed fantastically. Sweden has managed very well. All the countries that have all the benefits of belonging to Europe but haven't joined the euro are doing fantastically well, with a few exceptions like Hungary, but by and large. In the U.S., I mean, I'm not American, but I share your pessimism. I think that the willingness to change and the ability to put that into effect is very much reduced. And Japan, we all know about Japan. So my hope doesn't lie in governments. It lies in, when I look at Africa, well, let's start with Hungary and telephones. When I went to Hungary at about the same time, you may have been in these government offices, and they had phones on their desks, these officials, and the more important they were, the more of them they had, and so on, because it was like that. And you see that thing on the ceiling, that projector. Well, this is very small compared to the size of these telephones. They look like a suitcase and a safe deposit box kind of thing combined. Today, half of all Africans have cell phones. Now, why do they have cell phones? Because governments were asleep at the wheel. It happened in spite of government. If governments had noticed this, you wouldn't have cell phones today. Same in Bangalore. The Bangalore miracle, it totally escaped the notice of the Indian government to begin with. And by the time they noticed, it was so popular, all this information technology, cell phones, etc., that no politician in the country would have dared take it away. In Kenya, you have the same thing. You have cell phone banking. at one point the established banks tried to get the government to have regulations that would kind of pull back and limit what you can do on a cell phone. Government never dared touch it. I mean, it would have been a revolution on the streets if they had done. You have kids in Kibera, one of the biggest slums in Africa, who are doing apps and so on today. And I mean, no one could have imagined this. It gets farmers out of isolation. It tells them at what price they can sell their stuff. I listened to an amazing guy based in Washington who's developed an application with which people can report medical information in Africa in a very kind of low-cost manner, which can save a huge amount of lives. I mean, it's just boundless. So I'm fairly optimistic, not because of governments, but because there's things happening in society which come back to what you have here in your brains, and it's just incredible what's happening. And if it happens in Africa, that was the toughest nut to crack, and everybody was despondent about Africa 10 years ago. Today they're all talking about the huge growth rate, and there's a book called Africa Rising, which is a nice little book. It has a lot of, it only shows the glass, the half full part of the glass. It doesn't show the half empty part, but it's very, very cheering, because here was a continent that people had given up, essentially, and today it's booming.
Thank you, Bill, very much for bringing this optimism. And I must say, I agree with you even more than I did after the first part. But to be more credible, I will say that I still do not agree with one thing that you said in the first intervention about the capital that fuels innovation. And I will tell you why. But let me first ask Guy, do you have a Facebook account?
Yes.
Okay, I will stop there, because I do not have. Not because I cannot afford, but because I just don't need it. I haven't developed the need to use it.
You're still working full-time in an organization.
I
have some leisure time.
I have that actually Facebook established account for me based on my another account, but I'm not sure. I haven't used it yet. But what I want to say is that technology exists. Technology is there, it's accessible. It's just my preference if I want to use it. And this is the response to the example that you mentioned, Sonia. I don't. Well, of course, there might be individual situations where people have problems with access, but I think the technology is there. It's just we just need to learn about what is accessible and how to use it. And I would like to rephrase a gentleman who became very popular, but for different reasons. Mr. Dominique Strauss-Kahn, former managing director of the IMF, and I must say, based on my interaction and also of my governor, Marek Belka, who worked with him in multiple instances, Dominique Strauss-Kahn is extremely bright gentleman. And the way he connects research with economic and abstract thinking is absolutely amazing, absolutely amazing. And during the last annual meeting that Mr. Strauss-Kahn attended as a chairman, as managing director of the IMF in 2010, in October 2010, he told a very interesting story about the Industrial Revolution that started 200 years ago, which created something that was unprecedented at that time in the history of global economic growth. That some countries, relatively small in terms of their land or population capacity, developed proprietary technology that allowed them to control other nations and to become much more powerful. And as I said, this was something that was completely unprecedented, because earlier everybody had equal access to technology, and all what matters was the size of population of individual nations. And now through the development, through the innovation process, we are starting to close this loop and to get to the point that maybe it's not we are not there yet, but we will be there very, very soon. That the access to technology, that the marginal cost of access to technology will equal zero. And this will allow, once again, all those big countries where population matters to play more and more important role in the global economy.
Thank you. Yes, absolutely, innovation, entrepreneurship, and hopefully, we'll be able to see a lot more of that moving ahead into the future. In the interest of time, I wanted to open the floor up to questions from the audience. If you could introduce yourself and just state your affiliation, that would be great. Thanks.
My name is Steve Ritter. I work for a development company that works in microfinance projects and also micro enterprise growth. My question is, we've talked a lot about the challenges of the world, and in particular the Western governments. And really there's two questions here. One, can productivity gains in the West overcome those challenges? And two, kind of going back to the question that was posed earlier, can we take those productivity gains and replicate those in emerging markets?
Big question. Just to comment, I think that Bill would have the numbers on productivity growth and so on. There's this book that came out quite recently that claims that all the low-hanging fruit has been plucked, and that now we're in a phase where there isn't any kind of reason to hope that there'll be anything like what we've experienced in the past with electricity, the telephone, I mean, you name it, up to television and computers, etc., etc. I don't know if that's right or not. But as for transferability, that is a huge problem. It's a very, very deep issue. I was sitting at the Korean Development Institute many years ago, and they were talking about technology and transfer of technology and so on and so forth. And there was a gentleman from Ghana who was there, and he was totally bewildered because, I mean, you might have had somebody from the planet Mars sit there, because the difference between Ghana, especially in those days, and Korea, there was just no relevance at all. So I think people speak rather glibly about transferring, for example, institutions like some forms of property right or legislation or whatever from one country to the other. Every country is different, everything is local, everything has to be adapted. And if the gap is too big between one country and another, it's not good. It's kind of like taking a plant out of a pot and hoping that it'll grow in another pot that's much smaller, something like that. They're a huge problem. You can do it to a large extent. I mean, they're talking about cell phones, etc. So I think there's an area where it works. But when you get to institutions, which are really, as people know very well at George Mason, very fundamental, I found that it is almost impossible to transfer institutions, let's say, from one country to another, especially if one is a country that has been affluent for the last 200 years and one is a very poor country.
Well, I totally agree with that. I'd just like to challenge the notion that productivity gains can overcome the challenge. So there are two things operating here in my mind. Just follow my kind of thought experiment. You have two countries, A and B. One country has a young profile. The other country has an older profile. Let's leave aside intransigence of political struggles and so forth. Which of the two countries is most likely to adapt most quickly to new technology? It would be the younger country. And why is that? Because those people are still in the workforce, creating wealth for themselves, for their children, for their country, and so forth. The older country will have less of an incentive to take on the new technology. Now let's go in and look at reality. We have a younger world and we have an older world. We have North and South. I think that's a very interesting divide, but I really like the demographics about that. Those are most interesting. And the older part of the world is, for better or worse, the place where most of the capital is right now. My concern is that capital will be sponged up by paying old consumption and not new investing. And so rather than have what would be the typical thing, the older part of the world sending capital to the newer part of the world, where the technology will be quickly adapted, and new products will come back to the older part of the world, and we all have a win-win situation where even the older part of the world not interested in technology is enjoying the huge benefits of the new products. The transfer is stymied at the beginning because of the necessity of capital being in that transfer and not there in sufficient amounts. Capital doesn't grow on trees, it's created. The economy, by the way, doesn't grow on a tree. The economy is created every day in our minds. It's not a natural phenomenon, it is an intellectual phenomenon. And so we have this conundrum that we need to overcome. That's my only point. No doubt that we're going to have a bright economic future if we can overcome this problem. And I'm just suggesting, of all the problems that are out there, thermonuclear war's got to be the worst, right? Bubonic plague has got to be pretty bad. But so does worldwide flooding. 2012, that's a bad year, according to the movie. But all these things have low probabilities. The high probability is that we have a drying up of capital flows from the old to the new world. And that's what really concerns me.
Hi, my name's Jeremy. Thanks a lot for coming. It's been interesting. I work with two startup companies who work at the intersection of education, software development, and development. And I have a comment for Bill and a question maybe for Pete. Bill, are you sure that technology doesn't contribute to the older marriage rates in terms of age? And Pete, I'm interested. I believe that education is a driving factor towards self-empowerment, towards social entrepreneurs, and general development and progress. Management is interesting because it relies a lot on soft skills and interpersonal communication and things that maybe aren't as glamorous. And so I don't have much experience in Africa, any really. So my question, if you already could comment, is how is it best taught and learned in places where there's a lot of communication challenges perhaps, but also generational and cultural norms that you're up against? And how does your network maybe help overcome those challenges?
I could answer, there's a 3-hour answer to this, and a 3-second, but I'll give you the 3-second one. It's all a matter of marrying global best practice with local circumstances. And the way you do that is by bringing together people who are good at both, and it happens.
Any other questions? Yes, sir.
I guess this question's for Guy. I recently went to South Africa on vacation, and I was wondering.
Good for you.
Thought that a lot of the growth in sub-Saharan Africa recently, I think you said 10 years ago, was considered hopeless, is in part due to the integration of South Africa's economy with the rest of the sub-Saharan African nations post-apartheid, and the transfer of management skills and the ability to set up cellular networks and larger organizations that was there in South Africa previously, and because of the apartheid regime not really integrated into the rest of Africa. Do you think that's been responsible for a lot of the growth, or a small factor?
It might. The South African economy is doing dreadfully, so it's not a locomotive by any means. They have intractable problems. The growth rate there has been very low. South Africans, curiously, keep saying, I'm going to Africa, when they go to Kenya or to Nigeria. They still have this mindset, at least white South Africans, that they're somehow part of Europe or something. They're much more used to going to Australia or to England or whatever, or to the Netherlands than they are to. They don't really know very much about the rest of Africa. Now, it's true that a lot of South African companies have invested now in sub-Saharan Africa, outside of South Africa. MTN is a very good example. In Nigeria, it's phenomenally successful. But there is also a lot of resentment against South Africans. Nigeria and South Africa don't have very good relations generally. I don't know if they're Nigerians. Yeah, are you Nigerian? No. Anyway, each of them considers themselves should be the kind of macho country on the continent, and that doesn't make for very good relations. There's a strong reaction in Black Africa against South Africa in terms of this is the new colonialism kind of coming in. So I would, quantitatively, South Africa is still by far the largest economy on the continent. I mean, it's that, no question about that. Nigeria comes second, leaving out Egypt maybe, but I think it comes behind. So in a sense, it's true that the end of apartheid has given a push at the margin, but I would argue that it's not a huge push. I think the main reason for progress has been, one, macroeconomic policy is now much better than they used to be in most sub-Saharan countries. Two, the commodities boom in the last 10 years or so has benefited Africa tremendously. Don't ask who in Africa it has benefited, but if you look at the continent, it has benefited the continent. And there's been a lot of investment, both mergers and acquisitions and direct investment, not just Chinese, but from all over the place. So I think there are a number of factors that have played out, and South Africa was probably one of those factors. Yes.
If I could only quickly add one sentence. I think in terms of the global presence of African countries, what I noticed in the last few years is that actually both countries, Nigeria and South Africa, they realize that if they want to compete on the global scene, in the global politics, they need to cooperate, and we see more and more initiatives on the politics with all the concerns existing there on the bilateral basis.
We're out of time, but one final small question. All right. Well, in that case, on behalf of Beta Gamma Sigma DC chapter, thank you to all the panelists for sharing
We would like to give a small gift to our panelists. Kara, she's our secretary, so please.
Thank you to all so much. We enjoyed everything you had to say. I'm sure we can have an entire weekend conference with you guys.
By the way, I promised to give you our website, but if you Google Global Business School Network, you'll find it.
Thank you.
Also, just one more time, I have brochures here from Merrill Lynch for anybody who wants to look at the services they provide, save taxes, make more money in the market. Now we have Adam Ben in the audience. He is from Merrill Lynch. Please feel free to talk to him if you want to talk about your financial strategies for retirement or any other purpose, kids education, and so on. And also, we have information from the Heritage Foundation, which is U.S. Constitution. Hold on, because you're getting into your, you better that. Thank you.